This is an introduction to the Odyssey, a very general and broad introduction so that you can get a general understanding of what the epic is about. So you can have some perspectives and a starting point to understanding it more deeply. A very brief summary of it is that the Odyssey is an epic song. Okay, that's important to understand. It was originally written for musical accompaniment and it was sung and possibly even danced to. So what we have left is the lyrics of that song. And it's written about one of the major heroes of the Trojan War named Odysseus. It's attributed in the ancient world and generally today to a bard named Homer, but modern evidence suggests that there were many contributors to the versions we have literally for centuries. This song continued to be performed and essentially edited by each new performer. The Trojan War itself happened sometime around 1188 BC. That's in the late Bronze Age. And that's a pretty scientific date to say 1188 BC based on material culture and also based on the constellations and an eclipse that's described in the course of the epic. So you have pretty hard scientific evidence for a date around 1188 BC. You also have ancient testimonies that consider the date of the war to be 1184 BC. So when the ancient testimonies and the modern hard evidence align, you know that you're somewhere in the right ballpark there of 1188 BC for an actual war. The war that we have described in the epic songs is very fictionalized, of course, including elements of the supernatural. But there seemed to be a real Trojan War and destruction of the city of Troy around 1188 BC. The Odyssey continued to be performed and changed over hundreds of years. The plot very simply involves Odysseus' homecoming after being lost for 10 years after the war. He spent 10 years at Troy and another 10 years trying to get home. Continuing on with the summary, Odysseus can't get home because the god Poseidon opposes him because Odysseus blinded his son, a cyclops named Polyphemus, who had captured Odysseus and eaten some of his comrades. He was going to eat Odysseus as well. In the time that Odysseus is away, his wife Penelope has remained loyal to him in spite of 108 young men who have come to marry her in the absence and presumed death of Odysseus. Odysseus' son Telemachus is treated badly by the suitors. Odysseus finally returns, tests the loyalty of many on his estate, and takes vengeance. A great deal of this story can be told and understood, the themes, the big picture, the meaning of it, or at least some of the major themes and ideas that are expressed by an exegesis or explication of the proem. A proem is the opening lines of an epic poem. The first 10 lines of the Odyssey are the proem of the Odyssey. This is a very literal translation, which I've included on purpose so that you can see the arrangement of the words and understand a little bit, a tiny fraction of what is expressed in the original language, even if you can't read the Greek. It starts out with a man. It doesn't give an exact name because it's meant to refer to everybody, mankind. A man, tell to me muses, the goddesses of inspiration, the daughters of memory. A man running in circles, which is what he's doing. He's going around and around and never getting home. Who very much was made to wander, in the passive voice right here. That means he is not under his own will did he wander, but he is made to wander. When holy Troy he sacked or he destroyed. Now this he did intentionally. It's in the active voice. That's a different way to express verbal meaning. This verb at the other end of the line is in the passive voice because he was not under his own control at that point. Of many men, you'll see that over and over again there's excess. He very much was made to wander. Of many men, it says, he saw or knew the towns, and there's a typo, and the mines he also knew. Two different words for knowing. This word kind of means having seen it, you now are a knower of it. And this word is related to our word know, like this. Many in the sea he suffered or experienced. Algaea. What did he suffer? He suffered miseries or pains. This is a word that I've left untranslated. The word algaea means, most simply perhaps, pains. So he suffered or he experienced, because this word right here, patin, right in the middle of the line, like many of the important words. Eden's in the middle of the line. The muses are in the middle of the line. This word patin from where the English word passion comes from, and empathy and sympathy, can mean suffering or it can mean experience. The Greeks don't have a distinct idea of which one you're meaning when you speak. It's up to the interpreter. It's up to the person who said it to explain whether they mean suffering more or whether they mean experience. But I think the lesson here is that you can turn suffering into experience. And that goes on to say, struggling in his psyche, which the Greeks locate in the gut, by the way. Around the heart, around the lungs, around the gut is where the Greeks locate this physical psyche, which is interesting. Modern research refers to the gut as the second brain. There are more neurotransmitters in your intestines than there are in your gray matter in your brain. There are neurons in your heart as well as in your brain. So it's interesting, the Greeks are onto something when they describe the psyche as being in your chest. The seat of your emotions, they think, is not in your brain, but your emotions, they think, are coming from your chest, your guts. He was struggling in his psyche, even for the homecoming of his comrades. The word homecoming is nostos. Now here's what you have here. Nostos and algeia is the word nostalgia. It continues. But the comrades were not saved, although he was sending forth effort. Of their very own folly they were destroyed. So it's interesting, in the very opening lines, you learn that Odysseus is not the cause of all of his comrades dying before they got home. As you read the lyrics of this song, you might not feel the same way. You might feel that Odysseus very clearly is selfish in causing the death of all of his comrades. But in the opening lines, it tries to disabuse you of this assumption. Of their very own folly, they were destroyed. And then it goes on to call them idiots. The word kind of refers to infants almost. Those who ate the cattle of the sun Helios, Odysseus told them not to do it, and they did it. And so there's a kind of karmic reaction where they are punished for that. So it might seem like it's Odysseus' fault, but Odysseus told them not to eat the cattle of the sun. They ate it anyway, and for that reason, one by one, they died. They ate the cattle of the sun, and so the day of Nostos, there's that word again because it's so crucial to this story. It's all about homecoming. It's all about Odysseus realizing that life is more about home and family than anything else. The day of Nostos faded for them. And then it concludes in ring composition. It starts out talking about something. It has the digression, but Homer tends to compose in this fashion. He starts out talking about something and he comes back to it. He starts out with the muses right in the middle of the line, and he ends that proem with the muses right in the middle of the line. From anywhere, muses, daughter of Zeus, tell us the story. Start anywhere, it means. So there's a quick explication of that story, and you get the main gist of it. Odysseus tried to come home. He suffered. His comrades were all destroyed by their own fault, and the muses are going to remember this for the poet because he wasn't actually necessarily there. Now here's some of my conclusions. The active and the passive and the middle voices, which we don't even use anymore in English, are used throughout the proem. I won't take a long digression on the meaning of these different voices, but it will become relevant as we talk about it. So the active voice means that the subject is doing the action. The passive voice means the subject is receiving the action. This would say Odysseus eats in the active voice. The passive voice means Odysseus is eaten. For example, the Cyclops plans on eating Odysseus. He would have been eaten by him. That's the passive voice. But then there's the middle voice, which means you're doing something for your own benefit or doing something that belongs to you. For example, Odysseus eats the figs that he grew on his own farm. Those figs belong to him, and so he eats them. And you can express that in a different verbal form. The verb would be spelled differently and pronounced differently, depending on whether it's in the active voice, the middle voice, or the passive voice. So anyway, in the proem, there are all these different voices used throughout the proem, and it contrasts the control of Odysseus and his comrades. And what you learn is that the gods are the ones in control, that life is unpredictable, and it is filled with suffering. But the question is, how do you deal with the hard parts? Do you deal with it like Odysseus did? Odysseus often doesn't deal with it in the best manner. In the end, he realizes what's important to him. Here's another conclusion. Odysseus, as his name suggests, is a man of suffering. I'll get to that point later. His name literally seems to be rooted in the word for suffering. And the suffering of Odysseus is in his psyche. It's also described as in his theomos, which again is a word for your chest in Greek. As much as it is in his body, his psyche, of course, is located in his body, but you understand what the psyche means. It's something that's mental. Even if it's not located in your brain, it's something spiritual or emotional. So Odysseus' suffering is in his body, but it's also in his mind. It's also in his psyche. It's also in his heart in a metaphorical way. It's not so much because of his comrades necessarily, but he's a man of suffering, and this suffering happens emotionally. And that's what I think you learn from this proem. Another thing, Odysseus turns his suffering into experience. Odysseus learns from the suffering. He's not a victim of the suffering. He doesn't get beaten down by the suffering. He keeps going. He's a man of endurance. He's a man of resilience. And finally, the poem is largely about nostalgia, the pain of homecoming. Algae, I told you, means pain, and nostos means homecoming. The pain of homecoming. You can't ever go home once you leave, in some ways. Everything changes. You can't go back to your childhood. You can't really revisit your elementary school and it be the same place that it was when you were in elementary school. Your parents get older, you get older, everything changes. The world around you changes. The pain of homecoming is what this poem is largely about. Imagine leaving your home and not seeing your family for 20 years. Odysseus turns his suffering into suffering for the suitors, and there's a pain of homecoming in that way too. He kills 108 men in his dining room. He murders them. He turns his suffering into suffering for those who tried to take away his family, his belongings. Again, a short summary. Odysseus suffers in his psyche because of his excesses. He is a man of excess. The word many is used 4 times. It's the most used word in those opening 10 lines. In 10 lines, the word much or excess or many occurs. And he's made to wander or err because he strives for homecoming he strives for homecoming from war. He's made to wander. It's not under his control. But what he ultimately wants is his homecoming. He can't save his comrades because it's their own fault. Maybe ultimately you're only responsible for yourself, although you can try to save others. And his homecoming will be painful. But as a result of his struggles, he has seen and known all of mankind. He's seen the world. It's been good for him even as he's suffered. And anybody who has been involved in athletics or training extensively for music, playing instruments, you know that you suffer to learn these things. For anything, really. Learning foreign languages, these things that you have to put extensive hours into. Of course, it's painful to do that studying, to do that work, to do that physical labor or mental labor. But that's what you get in the end. The suffering pays off. You turn it into a valuable experience. Even more simply, Odysseus has great knowledge gained through his excesses, for which he has suffered greatly. Now let's look at the structure of it. Books 1 through 4, there's 24 books, kind of like chapters, is what you might call, here's a little German word for you, a Bildungsroman. Telemachus undergoes a coming of age. A Bildungsroman is about someone who grows up. They go from being kind of this innocent, helpless, he's almost acting like a child. He's treated badly by the 108 men that are taking away his inheritance, treating his mother badly. But at the end of those 4 books, he's gone out in the world himself, and he's a better man because of it. He's actually more like a grown-up by the end of those 4 books. So the first 4 books are almost exclusively occupied with Telemachus. A little bit about his mother, Penelope, and some other things going on at the island of Ithaca where Odysseus came from before he went to Troy. Then Odysseus escapes from the island of Calypso. The word Calypso is the Greek word for I conceal, I hide. The word apocalypse means the removing of the hiding, means the lifting of the veil, essentially. Everything that's been hidden will be revealed in the apocalypso. Apo means away from, Calypso means I hide. He's been with this goddess, this nymph Calypso, and she's been concealing the truth from him that he wants to go home. He's been there for a long period. He makes love to her. She feeds him wonderful meals. They're on an island paradise. but he doesn't really want to be there, he realizes finally, once he can wake up and remove the veil from his eyes. Books 9 through 12 you would call the apology, not in the term the way that you're thinking, but again, that word apo, as in apocalypse, apo means away and logos means speech. In these books, Odysseus tells in the first person, meaning I, what happened for the last 10 years before he got to the island of Calypso. He retells his story once he escapes from Calypso's island to these people called the Phaeacians. He retells his story. They're the people that are going to finally bring him home on a ship. And he retells, they ask him, where are you coming from, stranger? How'd you end up on our island? And he says, I. And the author shifts the narrative from he, meaning Odysseus, to a first-person narrative, which you call in the ancient world an apology. It's a first-person narrative. He explains it. Now, you get that word apology in English because the apology is from his own perspective. You might look at the things that Odysseus did and think he's crazy and reckless and selfish. But from his own perspective, and think about things that you've done in your life, when you explain them, they all make logical sense. When you explain them, they're all perfectly rationalized. Same thing with Odysseus. This is his apology. From his perspective, everything he did was okay at the moment. That it also includes his catabasis, where he goes to the afterlife. Kata means down and basis means to walk or go. He goes to death. He goes to the afterlife. He learns that his mother has died. What a tragic center to the poem. Out of 24 books, right in the center, he finds out his mother died while he was away. Now, does he regret being gone for 20 years? But he has to go there because he has to settle the past. One of his comrades died and he didn't properly bury him. Fell off the roof when he was drinking. Shouldn't sleep on a roof when you've been drinking. But they left the island where they had been. They were on the island of another little witch, kind of nymph, godlike creature. Her name is Kirke, often pronounced as Circe with a C, but the Greek is more like Kirke. They were on another island with a kind of supernatural being, and they were partying, and one of Odysseus' comrades died, and they left, and they didn't even realize he wasn't there. So they had to go back and bury him, and they had to go to the afterlife. Kirke told Odysseus, before you go home, you have to go to the afterlife. And to me, metaphorically, what he's doing is settling the past. He's looking back. He sees his dead comrades from the Trojan War there. Agamemnon he sees, Ajax he sees. Ajax still won't talk to him even in the afterlife because they had some kind of quarrel. So 9 through 12, you learn what happened in the last 10 years from a first-person perspective. Odysseus has been wandering for 10 years. He even went to the land of the dead. All the heroes undergo a catabasis. It's the trip to the afterlife. And then 13 through 16, he returns home. He tests some of his servants. In particular, you'll note a swineherd, and there's some other servants that are important and loyal to him or not loyal to him, and Telemachus. He tests if his son is loyal to him. He tests if his son is, ready to fight. And he gathers a very small amount of allies for his ultimate vengeance. 17 through 20, he goes home. He appears before Penelope and the other suitors as if he is a homeless person. They treat him horribly. And then through 21 through 24, there's the revenge that he takes upon the suitors, murdering 108 of them in his dining room and then telling everyone to dance like there's a wedding so nobody is suspicious outside the walls of his estate. And then he has his reunion with Penelope, where he again gives his apology for being gone for 10 years. He tells his story to her. And then he has finally, it ends with his reunion with his father. Here's a more detailed version. Books 1 through 4, Telemachus journeys to see Nestor and Menelaus, Odysseus' comrades, hoping they have some news of his return. 6 through 8, Odysseus travels to the land of Phaeacians, because he's finally allowed to leave the island of Calypso. The gods finally are going to let him go home, and he's entertained by the Phaeacians, and he tells them his story. 9 through 12, Odysseus tells of his journeys. That's his apology, in a more Latin form there, more Greek form. And Odysseus returns to Ithaca in 13 through 16, is reunited with his son Telemachus, disguised as a beggar in 17 through 20. He meets the suitors and Penelope, but he doesn't reveal himself to Penelope yet. Wants to know if his wife has been loyal to him. In some versions of the story, we know Penelope was not loyal to him. In the one that has survived, she is. In books 21 through 24, Odysseus wins the contest of the bow, which proves that he's really Odysseus because no one else can string his bow, let alone shoot as accurately as he does. And then he kills the suitor once he's been armed with his bow. And then he reveals himself as Odysseus to Penelope. Now, some scholars believe that it actually ends in book 23 before he ever goes and meets his father. I don't know if when you read it, you think that, but it's an interesting way to read the story. Just think that it ends with his reunion with Penelope, not his father. Odysseus' name I alluded to has to do with pain. One option is this verb odunao in Greek, which means cause pain in the active voice, and it means feel pain in the passive voice. That sounds like a pretty good answer, because Odysseus causes a lot of pain to his own family, to his own self, bad decisions, to his comrades who all die. But he also feels a lot of pain, and he suffers a lot of pain. It's a common verb throughout the Odyssey. Is it used so often because the author is trying to make that point? Probably, making a little bit of a pun, reminding you that Odysseus is a man of suffering, but he endures the suffering. Now, there's a clearer option for Odysseus' name. In Book 19, we learn that Odysseus' grandfather, his maternal grandfather, gave Odysseus his name. He says, "My daughter's husband and my daughter, give him whatsoever name I say. Lo, inasmuch as I come here as one that has been angered with many, both men and women, over the fruitful earth, therefore let the name by which the child is named be Odysseus, from the verb odysomai, which means to be angry, to hate. It could mean, as the mythic origin of the name Odysseus, hated by gods and men. Although his grandfather says, I have been angered with many. I've hated many people. It's a pessimistic and depressing name, especially if it's given to you by your grandfather, because I've had so much hatred in my life. Name this boy Hatred. Hated by gods and men. The gods and men hate you. No wonder he suffers so much. There's also the interesting point, though, that in the proem, no one is named. I told you it's kind of about every person, every man, every woman. It's just about a guy, a human being. Interestingly, this theme is picked up again in Book 9 in his apology when he runs into the Cyclops, which causes all of his problems. When he runs into that Cyclops, he gives his name when he's trapped in the cave as Mentis, which means not anyone. But it's a pun, because this word also, the N is not pronounced in the Greek, but it's in the root of the original word. This word that he gives as his name, Mentis, or Metis, without the pronouncing the N, this name that he gives himself, Metis, means no one. So then he tricks the Cyclops, he gets him drunk, and when he falls asleep drunk, he burns his eye out with a hot burning stake. The Cyclops then screams, drunkenly, "No one has blinded me," and all the other Cyclopses ignore him. They think he's drunk and crazy. But the word is a pun. It means no one when you pronounce it separately, me-tis. But there's a Greek word, metis, which means mind, mental. It means he's a very clever person, which is his great skill. He's physically strong and capable. He's physically brave, but he's also a mental genius. This is the name that Odysseus gives himself to the Cyclops. And this MN root is also in the Cyclops' description as a monster. It has to do, again, for some reason, the word monster is related to the word for mind. So when Odysseus comes face to face with a monster, looks that one-eyed monster right in his eye, he gives his name as no one, but it's a pun on the word mind. Odysseus is pure mind. He's a representation of the mind that can endure. Remember, he suffers in his mind. He suffers in his psyche. But he perseveres and he endures, and that's what's great about him. That's what his story maybe ultimately is about. So some conclusions. The Odyssey is incredibly rich in meaning. All I've presented here is just a starting point, things to consider. There's many other ways to read, enjoy, and understand this epic. Along with the Iliad, the Odyssey is the foundation of Western civilization. It was the oldest text we possessed until things like Gilgamesh started to be rediscovered, but that wasn't until the 19th century. So in the 1700s, Homer was the oldest literature, really. It was thought of as the oldest. It was thought of as the foundation of everything. And indeed, it really was. So regardless of your opinion about Western civilization in general, there's problems with various civilizations, of course. I'm not claiming that Western civilization is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but regardless of your opinion about that civilization, this work stands as the masterpiece of that civilization that's informed the thinking of the intellectuals, the leaders, the scholars, and the general public for over 2,000 years. So it should be considered seriously. If there are problems with Western civilization, maybe they start in the Odyssey. But Western civilization isn't completely and utterly flawed either. There are great achievements, and the Odyssey is certainly one of them, and in fact, a foundational achievement of Western civilization. It's the starting point. It's a place to begin to understand everything that has happened since.